It was the largest man-made explosion ever, surpassed only decades later by the nuclear bomb dropped on Hiroshima, Japan. The accident in Halifax Harbor 100 years ago killed 2,000 people and injured many thousands more. Journalist and author Ken Cuthbertson has pieced together the chain of events that led to that terrible incident, which is well known where it happened, but not necessarily in the rest of Canada, which is why we wanted Ken Cuthbertson here to tell us about the Halifax Explosion, Canada's worst disaster. It's a pleasure to meet you. Thanks for coming in.
Pleasure to be here.
I suggested in the intro that most people don't know about it. That's my hunch. What's your sense of whether Canadians know about this or not?
That's certainly true. It's part of the DNA of Halifax. It's something that most people in Atlantic Canada know about. My mother, who was born in Halifax a few years after the explosion, certainly talked about it.
But the further west you go?
The further west you go, it's something that most people don't know much about. If they know anything, it's that there was an explosion, a bunch of people were killed, and that's about the extent of the knowledge.
You called it a quintessentially Canadian disaster. Why that?
Well, that's an interesting question. It's quintessentially Canadian, I think, because the reaction to the explosion. Canadians have this, we see ourselves as being sort of robust and not complaining very much. There was an explosion that killed 2,000 people, injured 9,000, wrecked half of the city, and yet within 2 days, the port was reopened. Within 4 days, the banks were reopening and stores were coming back, opening their doors, and people were getting on with their lives.
We just moved on.
They moved on. That was one aspect of it. Another aspect of it was the person who became the iconic figure from the explosion was a blue-collar guy, Vince Coleman, who was the train dispatcher. And the disaster itself was really a blue-collar disaster because it happened in the north end of Halifax, which was the working class area, the industrial area primarily. And when the explosion happened, the people who died were, for the most part, blue-collar, average Canadians. And as I said, the iconic figure who emerges from that is Vince Coleman, who was a train dispatcher.
Hold off on Vince, because we're actually going to bring up some pictures here on some of the major players in this disaster.
Yes.
Vince is, we'll leave him a little later on. Here's the first, Aimé le Médic. Who was that?
Well, he's an interesting character because, and this is one of the reasons that I wrote my book, is that there have been 5 or 6 other books written about Halifax Explosion. And they all tend to start with the explosion, and then they go forward from there. And when I read these books, I began to wonder what led up to the explosion. Who were the people who precipitated it? Were they negligent, or were they just victims of bad luck? And Médic was one of them. He was a French ship captain, career sailor. He was, 39, born in Brittany, which is on the French coast down near the bottom.
And what was the name of his ship?
Well, he was the captain of the Mont Blanc. In fact, this was his first voyage on the Mont Blanc. It was a ship that never should have been loaded with the explosives that it was carrying. It was an aging tramp steamer. And the only reason that it was loaded as it was because they were desperate to get munitions to the Western Front.
We have to set the scene here. We're
Absolutely.
towards the end of World War I.
Well, it's World War III. World War III. I hope we don't have World War III. It was World War I, third year. And as I said, they were desperate to get munitions to France. And they loaded this ship in New York. And they loaded 3,000 tons of explosives. And then some bright spark said, well, there's still room on the deck. We'll pile all these barrels of high-octane fuel.
So this ship is
a floating bomb.
A floating bomb.
And as one British naval officer said, it was a wonder that when the crew saw what was piled on the decks and down below, that they didn't simply abandon ship and just take off.
Second picture. Here's Francis Mackey. Who's that?
Francis Mackey is a veteran Halifax harbor pilot. And he has been about 20 years as a harbor pilot. Never had a blemish on his record. He's a local guy, comes from a fishing family, nautical family, and is one of the most trusted pilots in Halifax.
And what was he doing there that day?
He was aboard the Mont Blanc. It was his job to bring the ship into the harbor.
Because he knew the harbor.
Because he knew the harbor, and it can be treacherous.
Let's go to picture number 3. This is Håkon From. Who was he?
Håkon From was a Norwegian, and he's another one of the people that I was able to dig out information on, contact his family, get a photograph of him. There were no previously known photographs. He was a really interesting character, came from a middle-class family, went away to sea as a young man and had worked in the whaling industry, had been around the world many times. And he was the captain of the IMO, which is the other ship involved. It was a Norwegian relief vessel. In 1917, the German army had occupied Belgium. And like locusts, they were eating all the food. So the Belgians were starving, and there was an international relief effort to bring food through. And the Americans actually, before they got into the war, had orchestrated this.
So that ship was in Halifax?
The IMO was on its way to New York to pick up grain to take to Belgium. And they were delayed a day. So Hakenfrom, who was irascible,
Which
had
one
a
is he
temper.
in that picture?
He is the one on the lower left.
Okay.
And that's the only known photograph of him. His family has no other photographs.
Huh.
And it's like Medek. There were no photographs of Medek either until I got his grandniece to find one.
Interesting. Okay, let's do one more, and that is the aforementioned, the so-called Canadian hero of this whole thing, Vince Coleman.
Vince Coleman. Well, Vince Coleman is, depending on the source, he's either 43 or 45, but he's got 4 kids. He lives a block or two from the rail yards, and his job is he sits in the little shed, a wooden shed in the middle of the tracks, and he taps out signals telling trains to come, trains to go. Basically, he's an air traffic controller who controls trains.
It's an important job.
It's an important job. And should we talk about what happened to him? Or
Well, not
should we
just
save
yet.
that?
No, we're going to save that. Yes, we're going to unveil the story as it goes.
What happened wasn't good.
No kidding. To the extent that people may know something about this, they may know something about this because of this. Sheldon, roll it, please.
The train. What? People, get out of here! It's gonna blow up! Ignition ship on fire. Stop train. Please, God, answer.
Coleman, there's no time!
The train's coming in towards Pier 6. I've got to warn you.
Come on, Vince, come on!
There are 700 people aboard it. I've got to stop it! Come on, acknowledge!
That's one of those CRB Foundation Heritage Minutes, which,
Wonderful drama.
In 30 seconds tells some
Absolutely.
various stories of our history. Obviously, he's trying to stop that train from getting any closer to the harbor,
Yes.
lest it be engulfed in this whole thing. Go ahead, tell the story.
Well, the story is that they came knocking on his door, and he was with another gentleman talking, and they told him that this ship was going to blow up, and it was less than 100 yards from his, or meters, I guess we should say nowadays, from his shed. And the gentleman he was with took off, ran out the door like a rabbit across the tracks, and Coleman had his coat on, was just about at the door, and then he thought, my God, the train is coming, the overnight train from St. John. There may be 300 people aboard this train. My God, I got to send a message. And he sent a message, he tapped out a message to the train, but unfortunately he died in the explosion.
So he saved all those people.
Well, yes. Whether or not the train would have been on time, I don't know, but we think he did.
He saved those people, and he gave his life to do so.
Yes, the train was buffeted, but there was no major damage, or some people were injured. But God knows what would have happened if it had been in the rail yards.
So presumably, as he was trying to give that Morse code message to tell the train to stay away, did he, I don't know if there's any way to know this, did he not realize that he would be giving his own life in the process, that the time was just that tight?
Well, we'll never know, I guess, but he knew that the explosion was imminent. The one thing about the ship actually was that when it came into port, only the senior naval officers in the port knew what the ship was carrying. It wasn't usual for a munition ship like that to come into the port, particularly when it was old, rusting, slow, too slow for... The only reason it was there was because it was too slow to join a regular convoy. And the thought was that if it came to Halifax, perhaps it could catch on. Somebody would say, yes, you can tag on the end of our convoy to Europe. Because the U-boats were sinking ships right and left.
The German U-boats.
The German U-boats, yes.
Ken, let's go up to 30,000 feet for a second.
All right.
Or 10,000 meters, however you want to do it now. Halifax, 100 years ago.
Yes.
What kind of a town is it?
Insular. It's one of the reasons that the explosion wasn't well known at the time too, because it's at the end of Canada. It's at the Atlantic seaport, Canada's main Atlantic seaport. But the only tie to the rest of Canada, to central Canada, is a rail line. And without that, Halifax is just sitting out there. People tend to forget that Newfoundland didn't join Canada until 1949. Mm-hmm. So Halifax was Canada's Atlantic seaport, the place where Canadian troops were marshaled to go overseas, the place where convoys formed up, the place where wounded veterans from overseas or soldiers came back. They came back to Halifax. And it was a city of 50,000.
50,000 people.
Yep. And it was the regional economic center, political center, cultural center. And in 1917, as I said, the official estimate was 50,000 people, but it was a magnet. People came there looking for work. People came there for various reasons. So there was really no way of knowing how many people were actually in Halifax. The south end, the well-to-do lived there. North end, industrial area, very conservative in terms of its the sociology of the place, religious. The north end, a lot of large Irish Catholic families. Everybody knew everybody.
Okay, let's have you now take us through the chain of events on the 6th of December, 1917, which started with two ships, as you've described them, colliding almost in slow motion. Pick up the story from there.
Well, what happens is the Mont Blanc had showed up at Halifax too late to get into the harbor at night because they had nets that went across to keep submarines out. So they had to wait for the morning in order to come in. First light, they started through, and they were proceeding very slowly because Mackey, the pilot, knew what was on board, and with good reason was very cautious about it. At the other end, the IMO, which was up in Bedford Basin, the catchment area where ships anchored, the captain, Frome, was in a great hurry to get to New York. Coming up to Christmas, he wants to get his grain, pick it up in New York, take it to Belgium, and get home for Christmas. And he's impetuous to begin with and impulsive. And as the ship comes out of Bedford Basin, it's picking up speed, going too fast. Meanwhile, the other end, where the Mont Blanc is coming, there's a ship in front of him called the Clara, which is a tramp steamer. And there's a younger pilot aboard there, and I don't know what he was doing. No one ever really asked him, but he was on the wrong side of the shipping channel. So the result was not where he should have been. The result was that as the IMO approached him, there was an exchange of signals, and because there was confusion about who was supposed to pass where, they ignored the rules of the road. The usual rule of the road, and I'm not a sailor, but the usual rule of the road, as I understand it, is that two ships are approaching one another. One toot means that I'm steering to the right, so you veer off. The other ship does the same thing. They pass left side, my left side, to the other guy's left side.
Yeah.
In this case, because the tramp steamer that was preceding the Mont Blanc was out of its place, they tooted and then they passed the other side. Okay, so they passed rather than on the left, two ships passed on the right.
So there is confusion all around.
There's confusion right there. But as the two ships are passing, the tramp steamer fellow yells to the pilot on the IMO, "There's another ship coming." Pilot of the IMO looks ahead, and what he sees is a tugboat hauling a bunch of ashes from the naval dockyard over to Dartmouth.
Wrong boat.
Wrong boat. So he's confused by that, and then there's a bit of to and fro, and those two ships get things sorted out. But then the pilot of the IMO looks ahead, and he's looking into the sun. He sees another ship coming, and that's the Mont Blanc. Meanwhile, the Mont Blanc is looking and thinking, what's this ship doing on my side of the channel? Because things are totally messed up in terms of where they should be. Mm-hmm. There follows, to make a long story short, there follows a series of toots, great confusion on both ships, and at the very last moment, both ships realize there's going to be a collision. Both ships toot, 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 which is 3 toots, means they're putting their engines into reverse. But unfortunately, because the IMO was sailing in ballast, it had no cargo.
What does that mean, sailing in ballast?
In ballast means that it had no cargo. So they're sailing along. They put the thing into reverse, and I'm not a physicist, but I'm told that by the laws of physics, then the ship would start to skew sideways. And so they totally lost control of where they were going, and it just eased in, nudged into the bow of the Mont Blanc.
But I think one of the things that's worth mentioning here is this was not some grand full speed ahead collision.
No.
These two ships nudged each other.
Yes. The first officer of the IMO was on deck, sort of from here to 10 meters away from the collision, and he thought nothing had happened. He thought they had just bumped. The helmsman on the ship felt the same thing.
But evidently, there was enough of a collision to create some sparks.
Well, the collision dislodged the barrels that these characters had piled on the deck of this high-octane fuel. And what happened was barrels tipped over, ran down into the hole, the gash, and when the two ships pulled apart, the metal on metal caused sparks. Little fire, which started out just like maybe on your barbecue, quickly grew. And the French, of course, knew there was no way to put this thing out, so they immediately abandoned ship, which meant that the Mont Blanc, this floating bomb in the middle of the harbor, ablaze. No one on shore knew about this, what was on the ship, so they all came down to the water, and ooh and ah as barrels of benzoil blew up sky high. A terrific pyrotechnics display.
That's one of the interesting things about this, because it was such a sight, people from the town came towards it.
Absolutely.
To watch it.
Yep. And the first responders, as first responders do, the firemen immediately hopped in their fire truck and raced down to the spot where they thought it was going to come ashore, Pier 6 in Halifax. People gathered around to watch the display. Some of the other ships in the harbor, crews hopped in little boats to go over and help fight the fire. So these poor first responders who raced to the scene with the best of intentions, hoping to put out this fire, were basically racing to their death.
Incinerated right away.
Well, yeah, they were killed instantly in the blast.
Here's how you describe it in the book. All told, the Great Halifax Harbor Explosion of 1917 destroyed more than 1,500 buildings and damaged 12,000 more. 6,000 Haligonians suddenly found themselves homeless, while more than 25,000 lacked adequate shelter. Almost 2,000 people in Halifax and surrounding areas lost their lives, with hundreds of victims perishing in less time than it takes for a single heartbeat. Sheldon, bring up a shot of this picture we have here of the blast. This is the blast radius. Look at that cloud. Numbers don't always tell a story and give you the context of what an explosion can do to a city. So why don't you put some more flesh on that bone?
Well, the flesh that I would put on the bone is when you read the accounts of what happened to some of the people who were caught up in the explosion. It was particularly telling after the event, because the newspapers began running descriptions of some of the bodies that were in the morgue. They set up a morgue at a place called Chebucto Road School, a public school. It was the largest morgue ever set up in Canada to that point, and probably the largest even to this date. Where they brought bodies there. And because there were so many bodies, they had bits of bodies, and they had bodies that were intact and nobody had claimed, they began running advertisements in the newspapers, long lists that actually described some of these people who were there. And when you read those, it's heartbreaking, really, because we have a tendency nowadays, when you hear 2,000 people have been killed in an earthquake or whatever, those numbers don't really mean anything until you start to dig into it, or if you know somebody who's been involved, or if you see images. And it really, that's one of the things that affected me when I did my research into this, was that I really started to feel some empathy, serious empathy for these people. As I said, because prior to that, they're just numbers. It's 2,000 dead. What does that mean? 9,000 injured. What does that mean?
Let's remember, it's 2,000 dead, not in a country of 35 million people at the time. It's 2,000 dead in a country of 8 million.
It's 1 in 25 who die in Halifax out of the population of 50,000. I extrapolate. I have done this. I was talking with a group the other night, and I mentioned that if this happened in Toronto with 2.8 million people, I believe it is, there'd be 112,000 dead, and there'd be 500,000 wounded.
That's the equivalent.
Yes.
Astonishing. Here's some more pictures. This is the aftermath. Sheldon, let's bring these up. Thank you. What are we looking at here, Ken?
We're looking at the train station, the main train station in Halifax. It had a glass roof, and glass and girders, and it collapsed. And there were 60 some odd people killed there. Passengers on trains, people, rail workers. And that was this is actually a postcard. That's another thing that I found interesting, is after the disaster, this is grim, really, black as it can be. But they started selling postcards. They started selling, there were books written about it, of views of the disaster. And people were actually making money out of it.
We got another one we want to bring up as well. Tell us what we're looking at here.
This is the north end of Halifax. That's what it looked like after the blast. The blast happened in a spot called the Narrows, which is the narrowest part of Halifax Harbor. If you think of the harbor as being like a keyhole, it's not a great analogy, but it's as close as you can get in terms of an image that you can put in your head. It's wide at the bottom. It narrows down at the spot called the Narrows, and then at the top, which is the round part of the keyhole, is the Bedford Basin. And this is a view of the Narrows. There's a hill there called Fort Needham Hill that overlooks that, and that's where the worst damage occurred, this area called the Richmond neighborhood on Fort Needham Hill.
Let's do one more picture here. Now, what is that American flag doing there? That's what I want to know.
The American flag is there because, as I mentioned, Halifax being isolated from the rest of Canada, but it wasn't isolated from Boston and from the New England area. And in 1917, Halifax's main economic ties were north-south. So there were a lot of people in Boston, a huge contingent of Maritimers who lived in Boston, and a lot of people from Boston knew Halifax, and there were trade back and forth. When word spread that there was this vast explosion in Halifax, the governor of Massachusetts immediately mobilized a mercy train. And that's a really interesting story as well, is that there was a philanthropist named Cap Rachitsky, Abraham Cap, and Cap's is actually his name, a very wealthy man who was interested in helping people in disaster areas, and he'd done this on 3 or 4 different occasions, was willing to invest his own time, his own money. He was the person who they gave this mission to take a train of mercy with doctors, nurses, and medical supplies to Halifax. And they came and they set up a hospital. And that's the photograph of the crew outside. They did miraculous things.
Gotcha. We've got a few minutes left here. I want to touch on 3 more things. Number 1, the federal government launched a public inquiry into this. The Prime Minister of the day is Robert Borden. He is a Nova Scotian. How much pressure was there on him and on this inquiry to blame somebody?
That's one of the interesting aspects of this whole story, is that the disaster happens on December 6th, 1917. There's a general election scheduled for December 17th. What's that, 11 days later? Borden is the Prime Minister. He's from Halifax. The big issue is conscription, which is a volatile issue. The explosion happens. Within 2 hours, the Deputy Minister in Ottawa is trying to figure out a way to spin this so that it doesn't look too bad for Borden. So that's the reason they immediately call a commission. It's called the Rec Commission. And within a couple of days, they've got this thing on the rails. Which, I mean, if this happened today, we'd be probably 2 months before anything would happen. But then it was within a matter of days.
And he did win the election.
And he won the election. The Rec Commission was, I think I'm not being unjust when I say that it was basically a kangaroo court, because it was initially called to establish the facts of what had happened. It quickly turned into a blame somebody, and they picked out 3 individuals. They picked out Mackey, the pilot, the captain of the Mont Blanc, and another gentleman who was the chief examining officer, the naval officer in charge of the port, a British fellow named Wyatt. And they were the scapegoats who were charged.
Here's another excerpt from the book. There is an argument to be made that the disaster at Halifax, like the accidents that claimed the Titanic and the Empress of Ireland and the deliberate sinking of the Lusitania, were the result of collective bungling, hubris, and the foolishness of men. You do say in the book that there is no coincidence that all of these disasters, which we're still talking about 100 years later, all happened within a fairly narrow period of time, within 5 years. What's your theory?
Well, we were still, society was still going through that transition from the pre-industrial era really to the industrial era, when new technology was coming to the forefront. And if you look at explosive, that's just one area where people were doing a lot of things. They'd invented these killing machines that they were using in the Western Front, high explosives that people really didn't understand the impact or even how to handle these things. There was a photograph I got from the Library of Congress in the United States of a place called the Black Toms, and it's in New Jersey. And this photograph shows barges, and there are workmen standing it's heaping piles of shells, and they're passing things back and forth, and there's something hanging out of one fellow's mouth that looks like a cigarette. I hope it's not, but it may well have been. But that was sort of symptomatic of the way their cavalier approach to handling explosives. People were wary of explosives, but as in the case of Halifax, when the ship arrived, nobody really knew what the effect was if they would have an explosion. They thought it would be just the ship would blow up and that would be the end of it. But
They didn't imagine it ruining half the city.
that's right. But so the technology really had gotten ahead of people's ability to understand.
And we're still saying that 100
And we're
years
still
later,
seeing
too.
that because we come up with all sorts of inventions that were intended for one thing, and we suddenly find out that there are applications or end results that aren't what we wanted.
Ken, let's finish up on this. And again, Sheldon, let's bring the last picture up if we can. A century later, how do Haligonians remember this event?
Well, the photograph on the screen is a memorial bell tower that was erected at Fort Needham Hill. And that's the hill that overlooks the spot where the Narrows are. This was, the government gave money, the Nova Scotia government gave the money for this in, I think, 1983, and it was completed in 85. And there are 14 bells there, and they toll each year on December 6th. And this year, I know there will be a ceremony there on the hilltop. Members, ancestors of some of the families who were particularly hard hit will be there. And these bells will toll out the same carols, or not carols, but hymns.
A carillon. Yeah.
Though it's carillon, but they're tolling out the same hymns that they tolled in the church, the bells of the churches in Halifax back in 1917 told. So,
Are you saying there was no monument to this until the 1980s?
well, that's right. There's nothing.
That's astonishing.
Well, yeah. As I said, though, we're typically Canadian. We kind of moved on, and people in Halifax remembered, but you know, there were scars on the landscape. The Halifax Relief Commission rebuilt much of the housing in the North End through a planned community called the Hydrostone District. But that, again, that's another Canadian aspect of the story, is that the project was never actually completed because the British town designer they brought over ended up fighting with the locals, and they never followed through on his vision. So only part of it came to fruition.
Well, we're glad you told the story.
Well, it was my pleasure.
It's called the Halifax Explosion, Canada's worst disaster. December 6, 1917. A century later, here we are. Ken Cuthbertson, thanks so much for visiting us at TVO
Thank you,
tonight.
Steve.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit TVO.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.